So what we're going to cover is the axilla, the brachial plexus, and peripheral nerves. So we're going to first start with, just a drawing of where we're talking about. So right here we see the head of the humerus and our humerus right here, as well as some of our ribs, our sternum, our clavicle, some of the scapula. And what we're looking at is the different walls associated. And it's a good idea to have some of these committed to memory almost, but just have a general idea of where we're talking about. So if we're looking at the anterior wall, which is the wall that's coming out of the paper, we're going to see our pec major, our pec minor. There's also the clavicle and the subscapularis muscle, which is going to come through. The posterior wall, which is the wall that's going into the back of the paper, or the back of the subject, we're going to have the scapula. We also have the subscapularis muscle, which is going to connect back there. The teres major, the teres minor, the latissimus dorsi, the medial wall, which is going towards the midline. We have the serratus anterior muscle, the thoracic wall. And then we have the lateral wall, which is going towards the humerus, which, as you probably guess, has the intertubercular groove of the humerus. And right at the base, we have the skin and fascia of the armpit. So my base, I've kind of extended it a little bit, and this drawing is a little extrapolated. But the base is actually right at the skin and the fascia of the armpit. And what this box actually contains, and that's what's important, is it's going to contain the brachial plexus. It's also going to contain the axillary arteries and veins, the axillary lymph nodes. And so just so you know, like, this is our first rib, so the start of the axillary nerve is at the lateral border of the first rib, and it's going to go to the lateral border of the teres major. So we know our teres major is going to be back there, so it's going to actually wrap around and go to the back. And the path is actually, the path of this flow is we're going to have the heart, which is going to be like somewhere around here, and it's going to feed into the subclavian. And then from the subclavian, we're going to go into the axillary. And it has 3 branches, which we're going to get into. And then it's going to go to the brachial artery. But what you need to know is where are these going to actually feed into. So we're going to kind of combine the two at the same time. So now let's look at the axillary artery. So as I said, we have our heart. And it's going to feed into the subclavian. And it's going to go down to the hands. And this, what I've drawn here, is actually the axillary. And so let's think about the branches. So the first branch is the superior thoracic artery. And the superior thoracic artery is the proximal segment. So if you think about it, it's close to the heart, so it's got to be proximal. And what this is going to feed is, it's going to pass in through the intercostal spaces of the ribs, and it's going to predominantly kind of lead into the pectoralis and some of the muscles around there. But we're going to later get into exactly what this feeds. Next, we have the thoracodorsal artery. Oh, sorry, not thoracodorsal, thoracoacromial trunk. And the nice thing about this is, if you think about proximal to distal, you know that the closest is going to be the clavicular, because we're going to have the clavicle first, then we're going to go to the acromial, Next we're going to feed into the shoulders, which are the deltoids. And lastly we're going to feed into the pecs. And these are all the arteries that come out of the thoracoacromial trunk. And as we go further down, we've got the lateral thoracic, and this is going to pass along the lateral thoracic wall on the surface of the serratus anterior. So it's basically going to end up feeding the serratus anterior. And next we have the subscapular, which it's going to feed the circumflex scapular artery, and then it's also going to feed into the thoracodorsal. And an easy way to remember this is STD. So the subscapular feeds into thoracodorsal, so STD. Continuing on to this distal branch, we're going to have two last branches that you have to know. The anterior humeral circumflex, and then there's also the posterior humeral circumflex. And what to know about these is the posterior is going to pass the posterior to the humerus with the axillary nerve, while the anterior is going to pass anterior to the humerus and passes the superior to reach the head of the humerus. So both of them, as the name gives it, is going to lead into the humerus. And these three branches that we see here are considered the distal branch of the axillary. The deep segment, as you probably guessed, is the thoracoacromial trunk, which leads us into the clavicular, the acromial, the deltoid, and the pectoral. And the proximal is the superior thoracic artery. Next thing we got to cover, and this is the last one in this video, is the nerves. And the best way to kind of do the nerves is you want to start by drawing two Y's going in the same direction, a smaller Y going in the opposite direction, and then a big W connecting the first two Y's you drew. The Y's on the left, they're relating to the roots. And so our roots are C5, 6, 7, 8, and T1. So this is basically the vertebrae. And what comes off the roots are, we have the dorsal scapula right here. And then off the three, which I'm soon going to have to change color so it's easier for you guys to see, we have the long thoracic nerve. And then the next thing you got to draw is an X right here and a half X. So this is going to be your posterior, your anterior, and your posterior. So now that we've covered the roots, let's look at our trunks. So in our trunks, we have our subscapularis, we have the suprascapular, and this also, to remember, is the superior, the middle, and the inferior. The next part, we have our divisions, which we've already talked about. So the divisions correlate to our anteriors and our posteriors. And so off this middle branch, what we're going to have is the thoracodorsal, and then our two supras. Next, what we have are our cords. So we have the lateral pectoralis, and as we know, this is a lateral, the posterior, and the medial. What's also known in this area is the medial pectoral, the medial brachial cutaneous, the medial antebrachial cutaneous. And as you can see, the name medial pops in a lot, so that's why that's coming up. And then also right here we have our axillary and our radial. And the last thing is the branches. So we know we have the axial and the radial right there, and we have the musculocutaneous, the medial, and the ulnar. And I know this sounds confusing, but if we were to look inside the armpit, we're going to see basically a chain that looks very similar to this. And as it comes down, it sort of looks like this. So the brachial plexus, as I'm drawing, it sort of is going to look like a Y. And another line coming down with a Y branching. And then lastly, the last Y. And then you're going to see another set of connections like this. And it's going down. And you're going to be able to tug on each one of these. And if you tug on one, and so if we're tugging on this bottom one right here from where the ulnar nerve is, we're going to see this branch being pulled. So we know that this is going to link us into T1 and C8. If we pull down on where the radial nerve comes out, we'll see the same thing happening in C7. We know that this is the branch for the radial nerve. And then lastly, if we basically pull around the medial nerve, or the median nerve, we're going to see that this area is going to be pulling. So we'll know this is C5 and C6. But for this one, you're going to really go further up on the brachial plexus to see it. And so when you're looking at this, these three branches are going to be pretty big. I mean, they're going to be pretty thick nerves, so it's going to be easy to spot. Well, I hope you liked the video. If you have any comments or questions, leave them below. Also, I've attached a file with my notes and some of the images if you want to draw on them or write along with me. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, and please subscribe to my channel.